And here we are back again. Welcome to the second session of the online conference with the Ontario Network of CAPC and CPNP projects. We're here this morning with three folks, three women who have agreed to gather together and share their wisdom in conversation on the topic of trauma-informed practice. And so we are going to start with an opportunity for these panelists to introduce themselves. I'm just going to move into gallery view there. Okay. And then we have a few questions that will lead our discussion around the topic of trauma-informed practice. So we're starting off with introductions, and we're going to invite each of the panelists to tell us a bit about themselves, the work that you do, and your interest in trauma-informed practice, and just to take a couple of minutes each. So I wonder, Wendy, if we could start with you.
Oh, sure. So good morning. Bonjour ani gije manadu nindishnikas bubukuk kwe munzi Toronto dodem nume makwa. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm very honored to have been asked to participate to the best of my ability with these other great panelists and with all of you today. So I wanted to bring you greetings from Niagara, first of all, where the mighty waters are flowing, and just acknowledge our mother this morning and the waters from which we all have come and which keep us alive every day and every moment. So for myself, I'm the executive director at Niagara Chapter Native Women. We're part of the Ontario Native Women's Association. We have a number of chapters and councils around the province. The work that our chapter has been engaged in has been really around child welfare. And our most recent, probably 10 years or so, has been focused on infant apprehensions and the stemming the tide of infant apprehensions. So that is where the interest in trauma-informed practice originates. It's in the trauma that is first visited upon an infant who is apprehended, and the mother and the family. So from a generational perspective, I believe that we are looking at repeated state-sanctioned violence against Indigenous women and repetitive trauma throughout the generations. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along, and miigwech for listening, and thank you for inviting me again. Miigwech.
Thank you, Wendy. It's great to have you here. Peggy, how about we say hello to you?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Peggy Humphries, and I work for Horizon part-time and Fanchuk College Woodstock in the Child and Youth Care program part-time as well. As far as from a trauma-informed perspective, really became interested 4 years ago when I had an opportunity to do, invited to do trauma-informed parenting workshops for Horizon, and then kind of branched off into doing professional workshops as well, looking at different aspects of trauma and how we can assist people in being able to recognize the signs and symptoms, and how to look at our work as a professional through a trauma-informed lens, and have been in the field 31 years and wish I could go back. I did residential for years, and so looking at what I know now as far as from a trauma-informed lens, would have loved to have had that 31 years ago. So
absolutely. Thanks, Peggy. Now over to you, Germaine, for a little introduction.
Aminugajep, Sakajawaya Panasikwa Dishnakajib, Ganabajing Donjaba, Gigo Dodem. My name is Germaine Elliott, and I am from the Serpent River First Nation, and currently the Executive Director of Mama Way Wido Doctwin Indigenous Interprofessional Primary Care Team, providing service in Barrie, Aurelia, Beausoleil First Nation, and Rama First Nation. Prior to that, I was the program manager for a community mental health program under Inautig Healing Lodge. I've lived in Simcoe County for 13 years. Prior to that, I lived in Northern Ontario, in Sault Ste. Marie, working on a regional community health program there. My First Nation is between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. I went back to school in 2016 at U of T and was part of the first cohort in an Indigenous trauma and resiliency program. So I was interested in trauma prior to that, and we've been providing regional training in trauma-informed care for about 6 years now here in Simcoe County. But what interested me about the U of T program was the resiliency piece. So it's good to know about trauma. We should all be, trauma informed, but we also need to focus on the resiliency pieces. So how do we strengthen our families and our communities? So that's my interest there. And that's by way of introduction. I'm a grandma. I have 9 grandchildren. What else? Currently working at home, so it might get a little noisy in the background, but in this current circumstance of our current health situation, all of our staff are working from home. So,
thank you so much, Germaine. It's great to have you all here. I myself am using a pen to stop me from touching my face because I know that is, I hosted a video chat last week and I spent the whole time touching my face. So I've got a little pen here to keep me from it. So, so launching into our first sort of question, we asked you to think about how you would describe trauma-informed practice and why it is important for CAPC and CPNP projects to have a trauma-informed approach to program delivery, just from your perspective. So I think I started with Wendy before, so how about I start with Peggy this time? With thoughts there.
Yep. Sorry. So I think it's important in order to provide a effective care and support that we are able to help the individuals to be able to heal and move forward. It's important to look through that trauma-informed lens in order to be able to understand kind of what's happened to them as opposed to what's wrong or what's going wrong. And I think it's important that we recognize the signs and symptoms of the trauma as professionals to be able to, again, understand what's happening for them in order to be able to work effectively with them to assist them in their journey of healing. Another perspective I look at it is from recognizing when the trauma occurred, developmentally, the stage that they were at, because as people grow and move forward, they can become stuck at that point. And so when we're working with them, if they're stressed or triggered, their response could be considered developmentally immature at that point if we aren't able to recognize kind of that age and stage where the trauma occurred, or if the trauma is continuing to occur. It's important to recognize that. And as I said, it's important to be able to look at it from a trauma-informed lens so we can look for strategies and interventions that would be able to assist them to heal and move forward in their journey.
Thank you, Peggy. Germaine, what are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are that the importance of applying a trauma-informed approach is that that approach recognizes the importance of the spirit of the individual. And in my years of experience, like early social work did not understand that that human beings are first and foremost spirit, right? Spirits in a human body. And so a trauma-informed approach recognizes the value and importance of that spirit. And so when we're using a trauma-informed approach, we are working with the spirit. It also recognizes that behavior is a result of, or a manifestation of survival, right? So what that spirit had to do to survive is often manifested in what people might think is bad behavior or uncontrollable behavior, right? So then it becomes important to look at the source, to look at why, what is causing the reaction, or what is causing the trigger. So much like Peggy has said, what is causing a trigger to that behavior, rather than punishing the infant or the child for the behavior itself. And I think that's important because what we know about infant mental health is this is the foundation for good health for the rest of your human experience, right? So that, you know, also, and I think we'll probably get into this later, like the understanding and recognition of the impact of adverse childhood experience, the ACEs. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Germaine. Wendy, over to you for this first thoughts on just how you would describe trauma-informed practice.
Okay, thanks very much. As both Peggy and Germaine have explained, and you know, bringing those worlds together, I think is so important at this point in time. The worlds of the colonial aspects and mainstream, you know, that scientific knowledge, which is actually at this point in time proving much of the indigenous knowledge and what we know. What we've been working with through the spirit world. So, Miigwech, for bringing that forward, Germaine. I think it's really important for us to understand that all of humanity at this point in time is actually going through a huge transition, and part of the opening of the lenses within ourselves as humans to be able to start to understand trauma and how it has impacted on humanity is really part of that evolutionary process of moving us forward as humans and also bringing us together. So I'm grateful for the spirit work that is happening. And I do believe that while many indigenous nations and cultures speak of the spirit, others do acknowledge that and feel that, and I believe there is that awakening that's happening at this point in time. So to be trauma informed is actually allowing yourself as a provider, as a service person, as a leader or a worker, I guess, in that sense, to be able to acknowledge yourself, your own spirit, and recognizing why sometimes you may get triggered yourself. It's not that different for the other person that you're working with. So those types of things, when we start to self-reflect, how those things have impacted on our own lives and why we get triggered as a care person, that's the same for some of the individuals that we're working with. People who some people call clients. Where we work, we are participants working together, and we're team members. So we can talk about that a little bit further as we go along. I think part of the reason now why it's so important to be more trauma informed and more aware, in other words, take off that layer of well, when we're working with CAS, we say, put the legislation aside and let yourself be human. So it's really about how do you allow that layer to come off of yourself so that you can interact on a human to human basis. And more so now because there is 85% or more Indigenous people living off reserve, as mainstream and colonial institutions are finding more and more Indigenous people are in their programs, and basically we all need to be aware of the ongoing oppression and trauma that is still existing today for the Indigenous people, but for each of the providers as well to recognize that. So I don't know if that helped, but
yeah, thank you
more
so
and more
much.
it's coming to the front. Thank you.
So our next question is around navigating requests. So how do we navigate requesting information from participants, like when we're doing registration or screening forms, without putting them in a situation where they may relive or need to retell traumatic events in their lives that might trigger a trauma reaction? So if we could go to Germaine for this question to start off with.
So one of the things that, I can speak to our experience here in this region. What we worked hard to do was set up a common intake form for all of the Indigenous service providers. And so people don't have to tell their story over and over and over.
Right.
And so we were very diligent about that when we started, but it really requires a lot of oversight and commitment to keep that type of one intake process going. So I'm not sure that we're as successful now, but I think that is one strategy. And also, generally, when we're doing any intakes, we make sure that our forms are respectful, that there are no unnecessary questions on the intake form, that we only ask questions that are absolutely necessary in order to provide a good service. So, much.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Peggy, how about you? Do you have any sort of thoughts around this question?
I think, again, it's looking at, I look at it from the perspective of having those conversations and, again, working with people that have experienced trauma. It's really important to create that trust and safety piece. So developing that relationship with the individual prior to kind of asking those questions is one of the important pieces. So building that relationship and giving them power and control as far as how comfortable they feel, what kind of questions they are answering. I know at Horizon we do have a form that does trauma screening, and some programs are utilizing it. So it again is kind of across the board. So people are able to share it, as Germaine mentioned, kind of you share it once and you're not having to retell all the time. So I think that's, again, I agree, that's a really important piece to be aware of. Creating safety is another factor when you're working with people that have experienced trauma. And so looking at it from that perspective, where are you asking the questions? What, are they familiar with the person that is asking those questions? And as far as when you are asking those questions, being supportive and compassionate, respectful of them. Also focus on their strengths and their resiliency. I know Germaine mentioned before about their resiliency, but have questions or have dialogue with them during that process where you're doing the assessment. They have, strength and resiliency skills that they've utilized. And so really looking at those and capitalizing on those as part of the assessment is another factor that I think is really important to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Peggy. Wendy, over to you.
Okay, so everything that both of Peggy and Germaine have mentioned, of course, I don't know if I have too much more to add in that area. Certainly the relationship building is one of the most important places to start. And, the forms, unfortunately, are quite invasive. And I think sometimes, I guess the best procedure would be to ensure that whoever's doing that intake, and I'm really happy to hear about a one central intake in your area, Germaine, because those people doing those intakes would be trauma informed and very skilled at doing them. One of the things we found in our area too is that sometimes people might not answer the questions the first time around. So I know that there's this whole thing about not telling the story more than once, but people sometimes aren't ready to give all the information at once. Some of the questions we've all experienced where people have been triggered, and workers themselves have been triggered asking the questions. So I think it's really important to have that relationship built prior to having to ask those personal and probing type questions. And again, just the necessary questions. And I think going at their pace and listening, because I think in a conversation, sometimes a conversation, you can get all the answers for your form. So that's another technique that we've used too sometimes. And so listening and starting where they're at.
Okay, yeah, starting where they're at and that all-important relationship. And I've heard a few times, like thinking about what questions are necessary. So it might be interesting to dive into that a little bit later if we have more time. Any other final thoughts from the three of you around this question of navigating requesting information before we move on to the next one?
I think and I think Germaine touched on this, or no, Peggy maybe, is around the informed consent. So really individuals need to know, why are you collecting this information?
Right.
Where is it going to go? What's it being used for? And it brings us back to that whole colonial model of statistics and research. And so for the Indigenous community, it's really extremely important. And this is another reason why people won't answer questions, is because of the legacy of the generational atrocities and the current atrocities. So people don't want their information necessarily out there in a database. And it's an area that we're struggling with right now. And so that's just another reason why people may not answer your questions.
Yeah, important to have that in mind and know that and acknowledge that when you're looking to build those relationships. Well, the next question moves into the topic of boundaries. And we're asking, how do we make sure we aren't crossing boundaries, both in terms of professionalism and our scope of practice? How do we find the balance in supporting families ourselves and then connecting them to mental health resources? So, when we're talking to a family, we might find ourselves navigating waters we might not be equipped to deal with. So Peggy, let's go to you first with this question. I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
I think part of it, when I do the professional workshops, we talk about our own self-care and making sure that we are aware and have reflected on what may trigger us and the impact that delving into these stories and looking at secondary trauma for us, and that balance is really important to be very aware of. So again, looking at, from a boundaries perspective, looking at, the conversations and taking a step back and reflecting on why or whose needs are getting met by asking the questions or by you having conversations with them, I think is really important as well. Making sure that the focus is on the person that we're working with, as opposed to, us asking questions because we're curious or we want to know more. It's really important to not look at it from, our curiosity's sake. It's making sure that we focus on them and their needs. And then again, using your team to have conversations. And I talk to, when I teach the students as well as colleagues, looking at it from a lens of making sure that when we are debriefing and having conversations about the work that we've done, if there's conversations and you find yourself justifying why you asked a question or why you did something, I always encourage kind of take that step back, because that's kind of a flag for me to recognize maybe it was a question I was wanting more than reflecting on what that person needed as we were having those conversations. So making sure that we look at, are we skilled and competent when we are engaging with them, or is there someone else's service that does need to step in and carry things forward? I think that's a really important piece, is looking at who do we have professional alliances with, and who can we seek out when we may be in over our heads.
Thank you, Peggy. Wendy, what are your thoughts here on this question of boundaries and scope of practice?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, the colonial world wants a certain kind of procedure and a certain kind of way of interacting, which stops the human being from being human. And we're taught this in school, we're taught this at the colleges and universities, to squash that little voice inside that says, I don't know if I do it that way, I think I'd rather do it this way. And I think part of what we'd like to encourage is listen to that little voice that says, I don't think this is the right way to do it. I think this is a better way. And generally speaking, what we found, the way we operate, and we work primarily with Indigenous women and their families, but we do have others who come to us for assistance. And the reason we do is because of our approach. It's because we accept them where they're at, we listen to them, we offer the services that they need, and we go at the pace that they need us to go at. The boundary piece is something that's imposed by somebody else. I know there's legislation, there's pieces that we can't get around. However, we encourage workers in every agency, Indigenous or not, to think outside the box, understand that there's wiggle room. There's always wiggle room. And you on the front line in that moment might not be able to make that decision, but your boss can, your supervisor can, or someone else. And if you're getting that feeling that says, I think this is not the right thing to be doing at the moment or the right way to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to give them the opportunity and let them know that you're there for the participant. You're their advocate. So you are their sister, their brother, their person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, you have them in your hands. So what are you going to do as another human that's caring for this human?
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that there's protocols and procedures in place if someone displays this or displays that. But you know what? They could have just had a bad day too. And maybe they just need someone to listen to them. So the boundary issue is challenging for sure. We do encourage everyone to just try to think outside the box, see where that wiggle room is. There's definitely wiggle room all around every policy, every procedure, every regulation that's in all of the legislation. And if you can't make that decision, we encourage you to go to your supervisor, your director, your boss, whoever that is, and stand up for what you know is right.
Thank you, Wendy. Germaine, I think we're landing on you with the last thoughts on this question. And oh, I'm sorry, Germaine, you are muted, so you'll just need to mute yourself. There you go.
So one of my teachers, used to always tell us, if you want to help people to be healthy, you have to be healthy yourself. And so she always, what she meant is that we have to understand, much like Wendy has mentioned, that we have to understand what our own triggers are, and we hopefully will have dealt, with some of our own internal traumas before we go into the helping field.
Right.
Because if we haven't, that will color, that will impact the kind of support and service that we as helpers are able to provide. Also, I believe that understanding the scope of practice is important so that we understand our own limitations, what we can or cannot safely do with people who come to us for support. And we also need to be mindful of the power dynamic that comes into these situations. And so not to unwillingly or unconsciously use that power dynamic to influence families or community members around us to do the things that we think are important rather than what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
Mostly, I would say that a good boundaries will allow us to safely connect, right? So boundaries were never, I believe, were never intended to be barriers. Old social work tended to create the notion of boundaries using it as a barrier rather than thinking of it as ways to safely connect, right?
Oh.
So,
I love that shift in thinking. Please continue.
So I guess, mostly that's it. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. No, I do love that thinking of shifting as boundaries from barriers to opportunities to safely connect. Any final thoughts on this question from any of you before we move on to the last prepared question that we have? Okay, we have one more, and then it looks like we'll probably have some time. I think there are questions that have come up from the folks who are watching, but our final kind of prepared question is, what tips for trauma-informed practice do you have for programs, especially in a group setting where there isn't a lot of privacy and we're navigating different levels of comfort with sharing? So it's around safe space for those group conversations is where we're what we're asking your insights on. And I'm just trying to think who Wendy, would you like to go first with this question?
Sure. So it's tricky in a way because there will be personal information that will come up. I think, to Germaine's point about safely connecting, and I so appreciate the way that you termed that. It's about setting that stage and the environment. Early childhood education talks about that a great deal, creating that safe environment for children. Well, it's the same for adults if you're working with the adult group of parents. And so setting some of those guidelines at the beginning of the group. If there's a time period that you have to finish by, if it's noon, state that early on. State that everyone gets a chance to speak. And for the Indigenous community, we work a lot with circles. And so going around the circle and letting each person have their time to talk. And the other thing that we find happens an awful lot is peer support emerges, and others have ideas on how to help an individual or give tips to them as well. So not to think that you as the provider or you as the leader of the group, or the I guess facilitator is maybe a better word, is all knowing, but to allow others in the group to also share their wisdom and their knowledge with the participants there. Just a few of the tips I can think of.
Thank you, Wendy. Germaine, how about we land on you next around this question for tips for trauma-informed practice, especially in group settings?
Okay, so I would reiterate what Wendy has shared with regard to the creation of safe space. Like, it's got to be a physically safe space where people can I'm looking for the right word, where people can retire to or go to in order to be able to bring their spirit back into balance. So I think that would be absolutely necessary. I think it's also important to give children the tools that are needed.
Sorry, let's just pause for a sec. Let the binging stop. I don't know where it is.
Hold on.
Is that with you?
No, that's me. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
Okay. No,
there you go. It. Okay. Yeah, back to you.
Okay, so giving children the tools, right? So that I think should be incorporated into our programs, because children are so amazing, so amazingly smart. Helping them understand their own triggers and giving them tools to manage that, helping parents to learn about trauma-informed approaches with their children. There's so many resources out there. But I think the most important thing is to minimize the shaming that potentially occur, like when a situation happens, right? So to be careful that the child isn't blamed or the parent isn't blamed. Big much.
Thank you, Germaine. Yeah. Peggy.
So I agree with both of these ladies and their recommendations. I think the safety piece is really important, both the physical safety. So when I do my parent informed sessions, we look at, setting up the room and how that room is set up, where they choose to sit, and so the space and stuff like that, not having it too tiny but not having it too big as well. So the physical space is important. Psychologically safe, so what are they comfortable sharing, having that conversation, being cautious about over too much sharing, which could trigger somebody else. So we set guidelines as far as because the sessions are to be educationally informative for them to look at the trauma piece and how they can assist in an individual, a child or youth that they have within their lives or themselves to be able to look at strategies. So we set guidelines of, you know, confidentiality, what's said in the group remains in the group, which is what Wendy talked about, that confidentiality piece. Looking at, they have the choice as to what they share. So if they're not comfortable sharing, that they do have the right and choice to pass, I think is really important. Developing that relationship again, talking to them about their strengths and their resiliency as part of that process. They have coping skills, they may not recognize them as strengths or skills, and so even talking about reframing. So with the caregivers, I talk a lot about, as Germaine mentioned before, not getting caught up in that behavior and looking at it from the scope of what's lying beneath that behavior. So being able to look at it from that lens. So even in the group, as facilitator or others, being able to recognize that the behavior that you may see from an individual isn't in response to, it's probably in response to something that's triggered them as part of the group. So being able to look at where's a safe space for them, that if they do need to take some time away from the larger group, have that space available to them. So just like we do with the children and youth that we work with to teach self-regulation, have that opportunity for them to be able to find that spot. Where is that safe spot, and do they need, you know, is there another facilitator or a peer within that group that could go and be a support with them, whether you practice some mindfulness strategies or some breathing exercise, whatever the case may be, what skills or strategies that we can provide them for them to be able to feel safe. And again, that trust piece is important.
Thank you. Wendy, we did have you already speak to this, right? I'm just checking in. I think, has everybody's had a chance to this question?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't want to pass you by. So those are our, thank you so much. Those are our sort of prepared questions. We are at time now, but maybe Kelly, are you there?
I am here. We have a lot of great questions and comments, and actually you guys have answered a lot of the questions already as you went, and some comments have helped, but I thought I would read through a couple if that's okay, and if you guys have anything to add.
Sure.
We did have one that you guys talked about a bit with the safe space, but if you could elaborate at all. We have a question from Kelly R asking, what is best practice for dealing with a participant who goes into crisis mode during a group activity such as playgroup or a parenting program?
So let's, we won't necessarily go over, but just does anybody have something they want to say to that?
Are you talking about a child?
They're talking about a participant. I'm thinking a parent, but it could also be a child.
Any thoughts on that? Peggy, you're muted, so yeah.
Sorry.
Nope,
Sorry.
no.
From our perspective, when you know, working with children or youth or a parent, I've had parents in session kind of become overwhelmed with the information that they're receiving, and you know, they're reflecting on how they might have reacted to that child and those kinds of things. And so just again, having that opportunity to be available to them, allowing them And for us, it's about, I have training in prevention and management of aggressive behaviors. So looking at it from the perspective of pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis. So in pre-crisis, if you notice someone becoming triggered, looking at it from the perspective of providing them with support, utilizing, we call them calming techniques. So being able to either redirect or those types of things, to look at it from a perspective of what strategies or what do they need? Do they need someone, do they, as I said, in the safe space, do they need to be able to seek out another area? Is there somebody available that can kind of be present with them and coach them through if that's what they need? Or are they an individual that just needs to take a minute? In my sessions, I've had parents, we've got a signal that they can leave the room and kind of go for a walk or have a drink of water, those kinds of things. So just like strategies you'd use with a child to self-regulate, that's what I've done with parents that have been a part of my sessions.
Thank you, Peggy. Wendy or Germaine, anything to add to that?
Okay, we have a direct question for Wendy, wondering if she has an example of the kind of wiggle room she's describing when you were discussing intakes and other things.
Wiggle room?
Yes, the wiggle room you were describing.
So the wiggle room comes in really on the daily practice piece, and understanding that it would depend, I think, on the particular situation, but that many frontline workers don't feel they have the authority to make certain decisions that they would like to make, and offering that flexibility within a workspace for the frontline workers to be able to make those decisions actually does 2 or 3 different things. One, it helps the situation in the moment, because the worker knows exactly what they'd like to do and how they'd like to handle it. Obviously, it's not going to be something illegal, so they have a certain way that they think it ought to go. And it also helps develop leadership within those frontline workers, so, and role modeling for others and for parents. So I guess part of that, it would depend on the situation. So I guess a little more information or an example would be helpful to try to explain that, I guess.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's helpful at all to the person who asked. It's really around, I guess it's twofold. So we talk about sometimes cracking that nut of bureaucracy, the bureaucracy. So if you think of bureaucracy as a nut and the nut cracker coming, it has to crack from the top as well as the bottom in order to get through the red tape and the bureaucracy of what are the regulations, what are the policies, and even the legislation can start to be cracked from the top from pushing from the bottom. So it's really around the frontline worker has an idea on what to do and how to handle this, but their supervisor is saying, no, we have this certain policy, you have to do it this way. Well, when is it okay in that scenario for the frontline worker to say, yes, but if we tried this, it might work, right? And so that comes back to the work environment and the agency involved and what their policies and procedures are. And it comes back to leadership within that agency. If the authority that Germaine was talking about, those authoritarian pieces are in place, it makes it very difficult for a frontline worker to think outside the box and act outside the box and maybe come up with the best solution for the participant, which hopefully would negate having to go through it again and maybe again and again. So I think part of what needs to happen in some of the agencies is to allow the frontline workers that flexibility. So, and so what we're always saying is look for that wiggle room and pressure your supervisors and directors to give you the wiggle room you need, because you're the front line and you know these individuals the best. They know themselves the best, though, always knowing that I'm the expert on myself. So this participant is the expert on themselves. And so I hope that helps. It's a little bit of pressure from both. It's, you know, we're going into political areas that, but individuals can push it from the front line to say, this is how we think it could work.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you, Kelly. I think that's kind of the time we have for questions. But thanks to everybody for their reflections. And I do want to take a moment to extend a special gratitude to Wendy, Peggy, and Germaine for taking time from their schedules to come and join us this morning and share your wisdom and your thoughts around this important topic of trauma-informed practice. It just is, it's just so important to be a foundational piece of the work that we do with vulnerable families. So I think it's really important that we take the time to have these conversations, and I hope that we can have more of them as we go forward. So thank you for navigating the technology. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing of yourself, and on behalf of all of us here. So just much gratitude. And so we're going to wrap up this session, and we're going to take a little break. And I realize I forgot to announce the prize draws from last time. So we have a little bit of prize draw catching up to do. But with that though, I will bid the three of you upon farewell, and I hope that our paths cross again soon.
Okay, well, so thank you again for the honor of participating.
It was wonderful to have you all here. So have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Make rich, make rich.